A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Hey, can you imagine what it must have been like in the first century as Jesus' followers set about revolutionising the world with the good news that they were entrusted with by Jesus? Their cultural environment was vastly more hostile than today. They were few in number. They had little money and no powerful backers, but they were astonishingly successful, turning the world upside down. Well, our special guest today has tried to rediscover the radical, transcendent, and sometimes, as he says, downright weird message of Jesus. He says there is an answer. There's even a model, and it's been successful before. Greg Sheridan is one of Australia's best-known journalists. He's a long-time foreign editor at the Australian newspaper. You might have seen him on Sky News. Well, his new book is called How Christians Can Succeed Today, Reclaiming the Genius of the Early Church. It's the third title in Greg Sheridan's best-selling trilogy about Christianity in the modern world. His most recent books are the best-selling Christians, The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World, and That God is Good for You. And it's his ninth book overall, but the third in this trilogy. Let me say a special welcome along to 2020 to Greg Sheridan. Hey, Greg.
Hey, Neil, it's great to be with you. And gosh, that was a beautiful bit of music you played at the start. And it's fantastic fun to be alive, isn't it?
It is. And, we might get into that too. Where would we be if we didn't have Jesus? You can answer that question perhaps or contemplate it individually, but you can contemplate it too as a nation. Hey, let's start with something. I mentioned there in the introduction, Greg, you start your book with the thought that first century Christians looked a little bit weird to the rulers of the day. What did you mean by weird?
Well, Neil, let me explain the approach of the book to get into that question of weirdness. A friend of mine said to me, all the Christians now, we're looking, how can we succeed in this culture? For 1,800 years, 1,700 years, we've never been in a position where we're sort of not only not the majority, but we're kind of held in sometimes contempt and hostility and ridicule and so on. You don't want to overstate that, but that's a reality. And it just occurred to me that obviously the people who dealt with that before are the first Christians. I don't mean the Christians around in the Gospels with Jesus, but after Jesus had ascended to heaven and the apostles were all gone, you have up to about the 4th century an early Christian community where the pagan culture thought they were subversive, thought they were corrupt, thought they were superstitious, thought they were revolting, talking about eating the flesh and drinking the blood of their teacher. And everything that they proclaimed in their ethics was absolutely unbelievable to the people of that time, that women were equal to men, that slaves could have immortal souls like everybody else, and that there was no hierarchy, that indeed slaves could become leaders of the church and so forth. Now, the early pagan society just held Christians in contempt, just thought that they were and then the second half of the book, by the way, is interview profiles with contemporary Christians who live out the virtues of the early church. But so I was looking for the early church figures and what could they teach us today about how to interact with a hostile cultural environment. They're a terrific group to study because they wrote everything down and everybody was writing about them. So we've got fantastic resources about the early church. I don't know why Hollywood doesn't make more of it. And as I say, the early pagan societies just held them in absolute contempt, thought they were a weird sect of Judaism, and they seemed to be hostile to what the Romans thought was the good life, orgies and drunkenness and men exploiting women and everybody exploiting children and so forth. And their behaviour was so weird. So when a plague would come along, there were terrible plagues in ancient Rome, the Cyprian plague and the Galen plague. 5,000 people were dying a day. Everyone else was running away, not giving aid to each other. The Christians stayed and helped. They helped each other and they helped their neighbours. And as a result, far fewer of them died because they got basic medical care. So that made them look not only weird, but wonderful. They also valued women, so they didn't leave their girl babies out to die, as was the case in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Very, very few Roman or Greek families had more than one daughter at the most. And Christian families had lots of daughters, so they were much happier. And then, of course, there was a shortage of women in the ancient world, so pagan men married Christian women and converted to Christianity.
Greg, I like the idea when you say weird, because weird is one of those things that a lot of Christians are wanting to run from, and churches trying not to look weird, but to mix the word weird with wonderful, because what looked weird turned out to be wonderful. I think there's still a bit of a journey of thinking for a lot of people around what our Christian faith does today. And you make the point that, the Romans thought that Christianity was pernicious superstition. The Greeks thought it was foolishness, and to the Jews it seemed heretical. And when it is so different, and when it is so weird, there's an hostility that developed in that early first Christian world. And you take a little time to unpack the fact that there was hostilities, and perhaps worse than what we've experienced here in Australia, much, much worse.
Yes, indeed, much, much worse. So there was hostility at every level. So the Romans, who loved orgies, thought the Christians were spoilsports. They couldn't understand their superstitions. The Christians didn't go round looking for persecution. They were very sensible people. They tried to live decent, honest lives, and they didn't go out of their way to court persecution. But there were things they wouldn't do. So the Romans told them, you've got to worship Roman gods. We don't mind if you worship Jesus too, but you've got to worship Roman gods. We'll even put Jesus in the Roman pantheon. Christians said, sorry, we can't do that. We'll pray for Caesar, but we won't worship Caesar, and we don't acknowledge all the fictitious gods that Roman mythology has. And Roman society at first was very hostile to Christians, and then every now and again, the official authorities would try to stamp them out. So the first great persecution came under Nero, who blamed a fire in ancient Rome on the Christians without any evidence. And then he rounded them up and killed many of them. He set some of them on fire. It was appalling. And then they would get spasmodic persecution for the next few centuries. So it wasn't all the time. It would come in waves. A new emperor or a new local governor would say, geez, these Christians are there's too many of them, and they're converting people, and we don't like it, and it makes women uppity. They think there's a higher authority than just their father, and they're trying to impose limits on what slave owners can do to their slaves, with their sexual morality and so on. But then the way that the Christians endured the persecution, the love that they had for the people who persecuted them, their solidarity in persecution, even sometimes literally smiling in the face of death. And this is not just Christian propaganda. Some of the most interesting things to read from the early church are the eyewitness accounts from Romans and Greeks of how the Christians responded to plagues and persecution and the like. But in a sense, that sounds too dramatic, Neil. The other great thing about Christians in the early period was that they were just so much happier than everybody else. Their families were large. They didn't kill their kids. They had lots of daughters. They had a principle of social solidarity with each other. They worshipped together just like we do every Sunday, and they looked after each other. They had social welfare for widows and orphans, and increasingly where they could, they gave charity to non-Christians as well. And everybody suddenly thought, they may be weird, but there's something about them. There's something good about them.
When you have in your title one particular word I want to draw attention to here for a few moments. The book is called How Christians Can Succeed Today. And you've got this contrast, what was happening then, first century. You've also unpacked things that are challenging for us today. But the rest of your title is This is the subtitle, Reclaiming the Genius of the Early Church. Now, I know, Greg Sheridan, you would not have chosen a word like that very lightly. There is something genius about the way the early church performed. What do you recognise as the genius of what can be reclaimed today?
Well, Neil, that's a really wonderful speculation and question and thought. Two things. The first is, of course, the success they had came from God. So a great friend of mine, an Anglican pastor, in giving me advice about this book, said, don't attribute all their success to them. Remember that it was God leading them. And that's certainly true. Jesus, not only his example, but the works of the Holy Spirit motivated and infused the first Christians, just as it can infuse Christians today. But secondly, the story of the early Christians is that they really had to cope with all these practical difficulties. You know, the Romans asking them to worship Roman gods, and financial difficulties, and they had to pay excessive taxes and all the rest of it. But they really applied themselves to all of these problems, one after another. You see it in the letters of Paul with his early churches. They've got to raise funds to support the church in Jerusalem. They've got to look after people who've fallen by the wayside. Then they confront all these practical difficulties. So there's a wave of persecution. Some of them are very brave. Some of them give in to the persecution and deny Jesus or worship a Roman god. So then they've got the practical question, do you let these people back into the Christian community? Is it enough for them just to say they were sorry and then you readmit them to the Christian community? And they also were very intentional in the way they founded new communities. They would send missionaries, often in pairs or groups, to new territories, and they would proclaim the word of God. And if they got into trouble with the courts, they would defend themselves as best they possibly could. And they were relentless in using every tool available to them. You know, there's a wonderful passage in Paul where, in the Acts, I think, where he's in Athens and he's invited to speak at the Areopagus. And that's like being invited onto ABC TV today. You know, it's not a naturally sympathetic environment for a Christian. But he goes there and talks to the Greeks, contends with the philosophers. On the other hand, if he was in a place where philosophy was unknown, he'd speak in a much more simple way. So they would adapt their methods of communication. They didn't change their message, but they would adapt their methods of communication to deal with whatever audience they were dealing with.
An adaptation and a practical application. Just let me just reflect on some of the things you recognise about a crisis of meaning and purpose in life today, and some of the things that this genius might be applied to. You say lives destroyed by social media and hatred, feeble education outcomes, people falling in love with AI, violence in schools, destructive drug deaths, obesity, family breakdown, fertility crisis, and bitter social, party, political and ideological polarisations are some of the practical expressions there that there's certainly a call for Christians to apply this good news, this gospel, into this environment today. You've articulated beautifully some of the things, some of the challenges we're facing, and the gospel is just as powerful in its genius applied to those today. How do you reflect on that, Greg?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Neil. So the first chapter of the book tries to situate Christians today in comparison with the early Christians. And one reason we've had a lot of difficulty over the last 20 years understanding our situation is that we are in a kind of neo-pagan era. And the best way to understand how to deal with a pagan era is to look at the first Christians. But we're in a neo-pagan era in very specific ways. So earlier you had periods where people moved away from the practice of Christianity. You know, in the 1700s in London, there were 10,000 sex workers and only a couple of dozen people went to Easter services at St Paul's and so on. So that was a period of terrible social misbehaviour and breakdown. But nobody thought that Christianity was wrong or evil. They just didn't pay any attention to it. We live in a new era now, which is, in the West, somewhat neo-pagan, although Christians have made a tremendous comeback just in the last couple of years. But by neo-pagan, I mean that you've got really three groups. You've got the active Christians who are still active, still a big minority in Western societies. You've got the post-Christians, maybe people who had some Christian exposure as kids and have turned their back on it. A lot of baby boomers, a lot of people in my generation are like that. But then you've got these young people who have really virtually never heard of Christianity. If they've gone to anything other than a Christian school, they've never met the writings of St. Paul, the most influential writer in human history. They hardly know anything about Jesus. There's nothing in the popular culture that reinforces this. So all of our Christmas movies these days have no religious content or anything like that. Now that, in a sense, is a very hostile environment to Christianity because folks grow up without any religious sense. But on the other hand, it's also a tremendous opportunity for Christians because these people are not inoculated against Christianity. They didn't try it as kids and then, get told by the culture that it was all a waste of time. They've never been presented with the freshness and wonder and joy and transcendence of the Christian message. And typically, if you grow up as a pagan, you endure a crisis of unbelief. What is the purpose of life? And the early pagans had this too. They had no clear idea of what happened to them after death, and there seemed to be no purpose in life except pleasure and wealth and conquest and exerting power. And virtually everyone in our society today under 40, say, or probably even under 45, unless they went to a religious school or something, they've hardly come across Christianity. But that makes them wonderfully fresh. Christians can go to them and say, hey, guess what? You're loved by the living God. Jesus died for you. You've got a future of redemption and heaven, and you have tremendous human dignity, and God cares about you. God knows you individually. And this is a radical message and a very attractive and thrilling message. And as I say, just in the last couple of years, there seems to have been a turnaround in the fortunes of Christianity in the West. And it may be because this new generation presents an opportunity as well as a difficulty. It has all the hedonism and wildness of paganism, all the lack of purpose and so forth. But it also it's open to the freshness of the Christian message.
Life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 with Neil Johnson on Vision.
Hey, Greg, let me just ask your thoughts here on today's society. We've been talking about the hostility of the first century, the fact that Christian believers didn't have a whole lot going for them, and yet they were able to set the wheels in motion, turning the world upside down. Today's anti-Christian ideologies, you call them things like paganism and post-Christian, pure secularism. You call these attacks on humanity itself. And, when we talk about those sorts of things, do you think that we're sort of in the middle of it and not seeing the forest for the trees? How do you describe today's world compared to those things we've been talking about first century?
Well, Neil, it's a really interesting question. The non-Western parts of the world typically are much more religious than the West. So Christianity is absolutely on fire in Africa and Asia and large parts of Latin America. I mean, it's a bigger... there are more Christians in China than there are members of the Chinese Communist Party, and it's basically been all but illegal in China since 1949. But in Western societies, we are now in a time where, a friend of mine put it, we expected to be in exile in Athens, but we're in exile in Babylon. The everything in the popular culture argues against Christianity. It's very seldom that you see a positive Christian figure in a movie or a TV series. When I was a kid, if euthanasia ever came up on a drama, people would proclaim the virtue of life, and they'd support the person with friendship and help. And but now, every TV series you see just rejoices in euthanasia. It's wonderful. The early Christians didn't practice abortion, and abortion was very coercive in the ancient world. Women were forced into it more often than they ever chose it, and of course it was very dangerous practice. We're going back to the exploitation of women and children in our society. Our society has become very materialistic and greedy, quite lazy. So one of the great things about the early Christians is the practical way they had to deal with everything. So at the end of the Acts of the Apostles, everybody's living a sort of a commune kind of life, and everybody gives everything they have to the community. And then they work out that doesn't really work over the very long term. So they have to work. They need to have a bit of property if they're going to help other people. You talk about a poor church for the poor, but the church needs some resources if it's going to help the poor. And so then you have Paul saying things like, well, look, anyone who is sick, we're going to look after them. Anyone who can't work, we're going to look after them. But if you're fit and healthy and you don't work, you don't eat. And the Christians come to all these sort of practical conclusions. Our society has lost touch with everything that gives it meaning and purpose and transcendence. And I would even say you can't even hold on to the truth if you leave out God, because there's nothing absolute, so everything becomes relative. So there's tremendous confusion right throughout our society, and you see it in drug abuse, depression, violence, domestic violence. There's a terrible epidemic of domestic violence. So Jesus and Christianity offer the answer to that, and it's just as relevant today as it was in the first and second centuries in Rome. And in fact, we're much better positioned to proclaim that message because we have more resources and there are more of us relatively.
I like the way you have approached writing about these things, taking the first half of your book to describe those issues around the first century, but rather than philosophize for the second half of your book, you've decided to tell the stories of people who have adopted some of those early cultural values, something of the ways of Jesus, and applied them into their own lives. And you've reflected on the likes of Layla and Danny Abdallah, who are well known as people who forgave the driver who killed their children. You've told stories in your second half of your book, and they're stories that are pointed and they're stories that are meaningful, Greg.
Well, I hope so, Neil. So there are a lot of people in the second half of the book who are not at all famous, not at all well known, but who are living heroic, fantastic Christian lives. There's a woman, Jess Echeverry, like the Abdallahs, suffered terrible, terrible misfortune, and she's really devoted herself now to looking after the homeless in Los Angeles. And with her husband, she's a very happy person. But then there are quite a lot of famous people in the second half of the book who I was fascinated what they're doing. People like Dallas Jenkins, who founded the Chosen TV series. Couldn't get Hollywood funding for it, so he crowdfunded it, raised $11 million, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. 500 million people have seen it. Well, like the early Christians, he's using the tools available to him to spread the word of God, and he's doing it very effectively. Or Bishop Robert Barron, the Catholic American bishop, who's a genius at the internet. He's founded the Word on Fire mission. Or Jordan Peterson, who'd be very well known. And people have been a bit unsure whether he's really a believer, but in his interviews with me, makes it absolutely clear that he believes in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and that he prays to God, and that he prayed for his wife when she was sick. And a lot of these people have startling stories.
In fact, Greg, you call Jordan Peterson a modern superstar. Greg, why don't we take a call? Henry is in Redcliffe in Queensland. Hey, Henry, welcome along.
Yeah, hello, Neil and Greg. Good morning.
And good morning to you, Henry. What are your thoughts here for Greg?
Yeah, I got a thought about the early church. They were doers of the word. They obeyed Jesus. It says in James, be doers of the word and not just hearers, deceiving yourself. And then Jesus said in the Gospels, if you find your life, you will lose it. But if you lose it for my sake, you will find it. We need to get back to what the early church did. They were doers of it. We seem to just read the word and just, when Jesus said we're supposed to deny ourselves.
Henry, doers of the word, not just hearers only. Greg Sheridan, there's something that rings true with some of the concepts you're dealing with, looking at first century and today.
Yeah, well, look, thank you very much, Henry, for that comment. And, I think you're absolutely right. And it's quite a, quite a dynamic and exciting reality of the early Christians. There was no division in an early Christian between spirituality, doctrine, and pastoral practice, or, caring for the poor or caring for believers or whatever. Everything was in one. So in one of the chapters, I look at some of the great thinkers from the early church, finishing with St. Augustine, but also looking at Tertullian and Origen and Cyprian and Irenaeus and Clement of Rome. And these guys were leaders of their church, but they also wrote great sort of theology trying to understand what belief was about. But every day they were helping the poor. Everything was united. It was a whole life. There was no division. You didn't have one section of the church there looked after the poor, and another section of the church there looked after worship, and another section of the church there looked after, safeguarding doctrine or something like that. Everything was united. And I think, Henry, it's a great phrase that you use, doers of the word. The very idea of God, it's an active idea. We've sort of mistranslated it slightly over the years when we say I am who I am. It's I am being. I am active. It's I'm expressing this clumsily, but there's an active sense about it. It's not passive. So I think you've got a great insight there. And this is one of the challenges of Christianity. It offers you tremendous consolation and happiness and reward, but it does also challenge you, not only to avoid the gross evils, but to be out and about proclaiming the word and looking after the sick neighbour and the poor and caring for your family and all the rest of it. It is. So, I would just say, Henry, you've hit the nail on the head.
Henry, anything further to add?
Yeah, I'll just leave with this scripture. Jesus said that if we abide in his word, we will truly be his disciples, and we shall know the truth, and the truth will set us free. There's a lot of Christians. We need to be set free to be doers of the word.
Wonderful stuff, Henry. And just on that, doers of the word are not just hearers of the word, but knowing the truth. You do take a little time in your book, Greg, to identify that truth isn't something that is airy-fairy, actually, because we have a transcendent God. We can know that there are absolutes, and therefore we can have a foundation for truth. Any thoughts here as Henry's reflected that?
Well, that's right. I don't think you can have truth really without religious belief. That sounds like a kind of narrow-minded sectarian thing to say, but unless you have an absolute standard somewhere, then absolutely everything is relative, and even just the perceptions of our mind are relative. But at a more normal level for human lives, Jesus had a lot of very clear teachings. Some parts of the Bible you do need a bit of help with. You need interpretation and so on. You need your pastor or your priest, whoever it might be, to help you along a bit. But 99% of it is pretty clear. Love God and love your neighbour. And then Christians were tremendously open to everyone. The door was open. You came in, you were welcomed. Everybody was welcome. Come in, have a cup of tea with us, have some fish to eat. You know, we'll look after you. If you've got a sore wound, we'll bind it up. But once you were in, there were certain expectations, like that you would lead a moral life. Not that you'd never failed. Everybody understood you'd fail and fall over, then they'd help you back up again. But you couldn't lead a wickedly immoral life and think that you were okay with Christianity. Similarly, you would make a contribution. You'd contribute some money out of your resources to the common good, or if not money, some food or some labour or whatever it might be, and you'd pray. It's impossible to be a Christian if you don't pray. So these are all basic truths. And I tell you, as I've got older, the number of times I've heard people say to me, you know, my life is just happier if I go to church every week, or my life is just happier if I make time for prayer every day. So they're not even reflecting on a sort of a theological truth. They're just reporting, as it were, from the trenches of average life. So we're lucky because we know a great deal of the truth because, Jesus taught it and it's there in the scriptures.
Wonderful. Henry in Redcliffe, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line open on 1800 316 316. You can join in our conversation. Let's take another call. Natalie is in Camp Mountain in Queensland. Hey, Natalie, welcome.
Hello, and thank you. That's a very interesting interview, and I'll try and get the book. You'll have to tell me what it's called again.
We'll repeat that very shortly.
Yep. Just, am I playing semantics here? But the word religious, and you've just used it a couple of times. My son, who isn't a believer, said, "Mum, are you religious?" And I looked at him and I said, "I hope not," meaning that I have a very negative connotation, I guess, of religious means feeling you need to tick the boxes or do the work, but not out of your faith or out of love. And so I said, well, I don't know what you'd call me, but I love Jesus and I have a very deep faith. So where do we put religion and religious, which has a very bad name? And there's all sorts of memes about Jesus hated the religious. They're the ones that killed him, basically. Where do we put all that as faith and faith versus acts, which of course come together when you've got the faith to start with, but where does the religious idea come in?
Wonderful thoughts here, Natalie, because this is something that so many grapple with, isn't it? Because while we think of being religious as being a way of obeying a certain code and living a life of discipline, there's this relational element of our faith, and mix into that the grace that we are afforded by God's generosity. Yes, we can get confused around that word religious, but the perfect person to be talking about this, because, I haven't mentioned this, Greg, but you come from a Catholic faith, and the word religious it's got a different connotation again when you're a part of the Catholic Church or a part of any of the more traditional churches. But what are your thoughts here for Natalie, who's thinking about, am I religious or am I relational? What about my faith in this mix?
Well, Neil, it's certainly true. I'm a Catholic. There's no doubt about that. But my books are absolutely non-denominational. So I've aimed to explore what C.S. Lewis called the mere Christianity. That consensus really of all believing Christians who can recite the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. And among the people I interview in the book, of course, are loads of evangelicals, Anglicans, Pentecostals, Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and Catholics, and so on. And, one of the joys of our age is that Christians are all good friends now. So we've decided that the 99% of things we agree on is more important than the 1% of things we disagree on. And Natalie, makes a very good point. But on the other hand, I don't think we want to surrender these words to our enemies. But if a particular word is a hang-up for you, then just use a different word. But, Mother Teresa was a religious. Now, she spent her whole life tending to the poorest and most rejected people in the worst parts of Calcutta. And I've spent some time in Calcutta, and it's a pretty confronting city. So people can be inspired by religion. But on the other hand, if you've had a bad experience with a particular denomination or a particular minister or something like that, I would say just don't get hung up on the words. Of course, we're relating to Jesus. We're not relating to religion. But on the other hand, religion is also a shorthand term, which means the belief that people have in a transcendent being, in God, in other words, belief in God is religious. So I'm pretty promiscuous about words, which is what you'd expect of a journalist. But I don't think we should let our enemies define the words for us. I mean, the word church really means the people of God. So certain church institutions have behaved very, very, very badly. And that is another thing you see from early Christians. You see early Christian leaders telling their local leaders, if you abuse children, you should be flogged in public and thrown into the outer darkness and so on. So these terrible evils in human nature, or the fallen nature of the human condition, it doesn't go away just because you're a Christian. You still have to battle against it every time. And of course, Christian institutions and Christian individuals have done a lot of bad things. But my view is that overwhelmingly the record is positive all through 2,000 years of history. We have universal human rights. We have equality of the sexes. We have care of the environment. All these things directly as a result of Christianity. They're not universal in human nature. But as I say, I just wouldn't get hung up about words one way or the other. I mean, you can be a hypocritical religious person, or you can be a transcendently magnificent religious person. Father Damien of Molokai, who went to tend to the lepers, whom no one else would tend to. He was inspired by his religious convictions. So I don't think we want to get fussed by those words, really, one way or the other. But however, our caller has a tremendous insight, because in my books I avoid all religious jargon words. So I don't talk about evangelization or ecumenical issues or ecclesiastical, nothing like that. So I write these books as a journalist, exploring and explaining the common consent of mainstream Christianity, using the normal language that I'd use in journalism. So I'd take Natalie's point there. I don't use words much like religion, really, or church or what have you. I just use the normal vocabulary I use in journalism every day.
And Natalie, I think you'll note different guests on this program will have similar sorts of ideas that. When we talk religious, we really ought to be talking about this relational sense we have with God. And of course, there are controversies when the census rolls around every 5 years, that there are those Christian believers who, when you're asked the question on the census, what religion are you? They say, well, I'm not religious, I've got a relationship with Jesus, and therefore reluctant to answer in the way that might actually be best in and actually showing where the Christian church is. So there's all sorts of dimensions to the thing that you've raised there. But Natalie, in Camp Mountain in Queensland, thank you so much for calling in. It was a good question to raise. Thank you so much, Natalie. Hey, 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation today. Greg Sheridan is our guest. We're talking about his new book. Hey, when we think of the apostles, there's a tendency to think that they had it all together. But you take a little bit of time in your book, Greg, where you talk about the Apostle Paul and say he was the most successful missionary, but you also point out that he had a few faults and things that he was working with as well. You talk about him being a regular human being, about the fact that sometimes he had a bad temper, that he oftentimes, and maybe this is a good way of looking at the sort of virtue of having a little bit of a problem with authority. That might fit nicely with our Australian nature, and that he was a little mercurial emotionally. When you reflect on the Apostle Paul and maybe the apostles and those early church fathers as the church was becoming established, they weren't all perfect. They were dealing with tensions between this pagan society and a whole new revolutionary idea that the gospel brought, and people adjusting into the gospel idea of what it is to be righteous. That's full of tensions, isn't it?
Oh, you're absolutely right, Neil. And not only weren't they perfect, they weren't even, the first 15 or the first 11 or anything like that. They're fishermen and carpenters predominantly. And, if McKinsey management consultant went out to select the 12 most likely, they wouldn't have chosen the 12 apostles. And like the rest of us, they were sinners found by God. And, the leader of the first apostles, Peter, 3 times denied Jesus and then wept in shame at the Garden of Gethsemane. He fell asleep, couldn't stay awake in solidarity with Jesus for an hour. But he never lost faith in Jesus, and Jesus never lost faith in him. Paul, I think, is a wonderful figure for modern Christians because, like us, he didn't know Jesus when Jesus was around. He didn't have the benefit of having that first-hand experience that the apostles had. But it shows what a deep relationship you can have with Jesus, and this is emphasising your point about the relational aspect of our belief, even when you weren't there physically when he was around. But Paul is a wonderful figure. He is marvellously bad-tempered. He's also generous and loving and magnificent, and he's also profound insight, and he's a ball of energy. He just has this huge motor that keeps going everywhere, all the journeys he took and the churches he founded. There's a wonderful passage in Galatians, which you seldom hear in church, where he's very annoyed with people misleading some of the Galatians, and he says, I wish that they would all go and castrate themselves. And you think, when you read that, you think, my goodness me, for an apostle of love, that was pretty vigorous language. He has moments of near despair where he wonders if everything that he's done in his life really counts for anything. He knows very, very deeply that he's not perfect. He says, I still have this thorn in my flesh, meaning the continuing fallen nature of the human condition, the temptation to evil, to sin. And then there's a wonderful episode in the Acts where he and a friend are being followed around by this young woman who has the gift of prophecy, but it comes from the devil, and she's constantly annoying him, and he really gets very fed up with her. And it says in Acts, greatly annoyed, Paul commanded the demons to leave her. And that's the only case I can find where an apostle performs a miracle out of annoyance. He's so annoyed that with this woman for constantly following him and indeed proclaiming his truth, but doing so in order to gain credit for her own powers of prophecy, which come from the demon. And it's the only time you can see in the New Testament where someone performs a miracle because they're annoyed. And the great thing out of that, and then of the other early Christians who I explore after Paul, is they really were flesh and blood human beings. We shouldn't think that they were supermen or that they had such an intense relationship with God that everything for them was easy. Because even when you have an intense relationship with God, it doesn't make things easy, it makes things possible. And they were just as troubled by all the awkwardness of life and all the difficulties and all the bad temper that they experienced and that they experienced from others as we are today. And the more you spend time with them, I just so much enjoyed writing this book and reading the early Christians, because it's just like talking to your best friend.
Wonderful stuff. And so you take your readers on a journey from the first apostles and then into the early church and the hostilities. It grows into an understanding of some of those early church fathers that you mentioned, right up to a modern day and the likes of Danny and Layla Abdallah, people who are outworking some of these virtues and beautiful things that come from the good news of the gospel. And you reflect on the likes of a Jordan Peterson and others who are converting to Christianity and have the capacity to be able to stand on a stage and defend Christianity. But just as we finish off here, and we haven't got a lot of time to spend on this, but there's a little linchpin character that you do draw some attention to in your book, Greg, Saint Augustine. You call him the first greatest modern. He was presiding, Archbishop of Hippo at around the time when the Roman Empire was failing. He wrote some magnificent books, one of them called The City of God, and he was one of these who came from being enthralled with sensual pleasures to being able to recognise that he can look at life differently, as you say, like you can recognise the possibilities because you're looking at life through the lens of a dialogue with God. I wonder if you've got a moment, any reflection on St. Augustine as we just wrap things together. He's like the one who bridges the two, isn't he? The ancient with the more modern.
He is. And Augustine, Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, they're all in North Africa. I mean, in many ways, Christianity is a religion made in Africa, really. But Augustine was a wonderfully interesting guy. I mean, he had years and years and years where he indulged in quite, serious sensual pleasure, had a concubine, was going to marry and so forth. But he realised his life was empty and he wanted Jesus in his life, and he totally turned around when he came properly upon Jesus, partly because of the motivation of his mother. But of all the writers of the ancient world, apart from the Bible itself, I would recommend Augustine's book, Confessions. It's absolutely accessible. First few pages are a bit high-blown, and he's a wonderful writer, a fabulous journalist. Even now, his phrases leap out at us. So he invented the saying, "Lord, make me pure, but not yet." And he's reflecting on that was his attitude for a long time and how hypocritical and unjust that was. And then he reflects on how long it took him to know the love of God, and he says, "Late have I loved thee, late have I loved thee." It's a wonderfully evocative phrase. Why did I waste so much time before I came to this? And then but as well as this sort of seraphic vision, he's very practical. He develops the just war theory because there are a whole lot of Christian villages getting attacked by bandits and so on, and he wants Roman soldiers to protect them. And so he says, well, we're asking people to do violence in the name of peace. How do I work that out? So he works out the just war theory. The city of God is an interpretation of all of human history, which ultimately says to Christians, you don't have a city on earth. It's not Rome. It's not Hippo, where we live here in Africa. Your city is the city of God. And his Confessions really are the first great psychological autobiography in human history. And he's a wonderfully encouraging person. He didn't get everything right, and he's aware of his own shortcomings. He's always preaching for the poor. Again, this combination of the practical and the theological and prayer and his devotion. When he became deeply Christian, he sold his property and gave away almost everything to the poor. And yet, he had to run a practical. The diocese of Hippo was like just a great big parish, and he had to sort out everybody's troubles, their marital difficulties and disputes amongst the staff and everything else. And then all the order that he'd known in the Roman Empire was collapsing around him, and he had to try to help people survive that collapse, and he had to try to help their Christianity survive. And it's a wonderful life. He wrote something like 7 million words, and some of them have stayed with us, his sermons, The City of God and the Confessions. But, of course, the main thing you should read is the Gospels and the Bible. But if you're going to read one other book from the ancient world, I'd recommend Augustine's Confessions.
Wonderful. Hey, Greg, we have run out of time. The book we're talking about today, Greg's new book, I think it's about to be officially launched. Of course, you can go online at online booksellers, and you'll be able to find Greg Sheridan's book, and the book called How Christians Can Succeed Today, Reclaiming the Genius of the Early Church. It's the third book in a trilogy. You might recall us even talking about Christians, the Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World back in 2021, and God is Good for You that Greg released back in 2018. Greg Sheridan, wonderful getting your insights. I want to thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your heart with us today on 2020.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's a joy beyond measure, and I couldn't have enjoyed the last hour more. And thank you very much for doing it.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.